Hello, everybody. We're so happy to have you here today. Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live Q&A topic, we'll be discussing safety and performance measures and acceptance criteria. Our first presenter today is Laurie Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Laurie has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Laurie is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And also joining us today is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I will welcome Laurie to give an overview of today's session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is a 45-minute live Q&A, and we've received your questions that you established when you registered, and we thank you for that. There are many great questions that came in, and we'll get to as many as we can today. You asked about safety and performance endpoints, measures or objectives is another way of saying it. How to demonstrate those objectives are appropriate and clinically relevant. And we're going to talk about acceptance criteria, how to specify, identify, how you identify acceptance criteria that are used ultimately for the acceptability of the benefit risk profile of the subject device under evaluation. So we've got lots of practical questions and more kind of theoretical questions, and we can get right to them.
Okay, let's go ahead and get to our first question. And Laurie and Sarah, please let me know when you can see it on your screen.
We can see it.
Okay, our first question today is assessing our data is no problem, but setting the appropriate safety and performance measures is still a struggle. Do you have any advice?
So I'll start, but I'll hand this over to Sarah to say that this is a very common question that I get in initial engagements with clients. Is we understand the concept, but it's difficult we feel like it might be difficult or mysterious a little bit on how to execute it. In other words, we understand the concept of safety and performance objectives. We're not sure what the notified body or MDR really wants from us. So let's walk through that. So this is something that we talk about quite a bit. Any advice, further advice, Sarah, on that?
I know I usually, if we're helping and we have a client who is not really sure what safety and performance measures we should include, that's where we usually start with just really defining who are your competitor devices and then starting to look at some systematic literature reviews or meta-analyses or any clinical recommendations that are out there or guidelines. Those will generally all report on the same types of metrics, and that will give you a good sense of the types of data that are out there and what's really going to be the most meaningful way of comparing your technology to your alternatives and to your competitors.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Get to our next question. Always the big question is how to demonstrate that the data obtained are sufficient to demonstrate safety and performance. Any tips for this person?
So Sarah, this is the big question, is are our data sufficient? So this is really not so much a question about the acceptance criteria or the safety of performance objectives. This is about the sufficiency of data that's held and presented in the CER or PER on the subject device itself. So, those data have to be, those data on the safety, on the subject device have to be compared back to the safety and performance, under the umbrella of the safety and performance objectives, using the acceptance criteria as the measure. So Sarah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you could run into two main problems. Either you don't have enough data on your competitors, or you don't have enough data on your device. And in either case, it may be a function of just not a lot has been directly published. You may need to expand your search to include older articles, or to try to capture some historical data using like systematic literature reviews or meta-analyses of older data sets. But really what you want to make sure that your competitive landscape section within the SOA, you want to make sure that you have justified your literature search strategy, and that you've cast the broadest net to allow you to really capture all of the data that's out there that's currently clinically relevant to demonstrate safety and performance. That's really the main goal. You want to make sure that you've justified that through your literature search strategies.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. Are bench test results acceptable as performance criteria?
I'll give that one to Sarah.
I think in a word, no. When it comes to performance, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that this is clinical performance. So while you can refer very broadly, or you may include in vitro testing, you really wouldn't rely on that as any part of your performance criteria. You want to make sure that your results are all being pulled from data sets that involve clinical use of the particular device in question. So the bench test results would certainly be a part of the APR, because you're going to justify sort of if you're talking about an in vitro diagnostic device. And you can include a broad level discussion on sort of the science behind the tests, but I really wouldn't rely on any sort of in vitro. We actually exclude that as part of our inclusion-exclusion criteria when we're doing literature screenings. We exclude in vitro data. It has to be clinically relevant.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. Can you evaluate safety and performance measures according to the risk management system?
So I'll start off by saying that this is an excellent question. And Sarah and I were reviewing this question before the call started, because we're not often asked basically how does safety and performance assessment, the assessment of subject device data using the lens of safety and performance acceptance criteria, then how does that all relate back at the end of the day to the risk management system, the risk and benefit profile of the device? That's really where, in our opinion, the final arguments of the safety and performance of the device live, is in the risk benefit section of the CER or the PER for that matter. And I'll let Sarah expand on that a little bit more, but this is a great question to remind us all of what is the point of the clinical or performance evaluation of your device or in vitro device. And that is to understand the risk and benefits, clinical risk and benefits to the patient. But Sarah, do you have further comments on this?
Yes, so we all know that the risk management system is one of these like iterative processes. It's supposed to and expected to be conducted throughout the entire life cycle of a device. So the easiest way I can see that this would be applicable, or just to give an example, would be, let's say that your initial CER gets published and you have 6-month data on your device. As your risk management system is continuing to collect data throughout the life cycle, maybe now you have 12-month or 24 months. you will want to collect safety and performance measures, but if you start to identify that there are differences that arise at 12 months out or 24 months out, you would certainly want to adjust your safety and performance measures so that rather than only identifying data at the 6-month time frame, you may want to include an evaluation comparing 6 months and 12 months or something to that effect. So you will definitely use the information that you're gathering through that risk management system to help you inform and sort of make adjustments to your safety and performance measures along the way between revisions.
It's been our experience in the many times that we've been asked to assist with regulatory responses from the notified body that this is a focus. If the notified body reviewer isn't clear on how the assessment of safety and performance objectives and endpoints and acceptance criteria for the subject device data and any new identified harms, risks, anything like that as a part of the evaluation of the subject device data for the time period of the CER or PER, if they're not clear that that information is ultimately ran through the lens of risk and benefit to the patient, in other words, does it alter, is anything that we've performed an analysis of data for the last 5 years or whatever it might be, are there any new trends? So we're looking at the data, but ultimately at the end of the day, how does it impact the patient's risk and benefit profile? And so I love the question because in our opinion, like I said, the risk benefit section of the CER, PER is where the final arguments go to live in those reports. And because those are highly scrutinized sections of those documents. We can go to the next question. Thanks so much for asking that question.
Okay, here's our next question. Could you give an example of performance and safety claim for an orthopedic implantable device that will not be removed?
So yes, so we have.
I'll let Sarah. So Sarah,
Yeah.
let me just jump in and just say, well, I just noticed a funny word in there, and so Sarah's going to answer this question. But an example of a performance and safety claim. So I'm not sure if we're really talking about claims here or that an objective, safety and performance objective. A claim is very different than the safety and performance objectives. I just want to put that disclaimer out there.
Yeah,
I think
usually
Sarah, you're going to answer it. You're going to answer it more like it's an objective, I think, right?
Yeah. Usually when we see the word claim show up, it's more in the marketing language or in the IFU. Whereas in the state-of-the-art section, you're really going to focus in on the performance measures or the criteria that you're using to judge your subject device. So for something like an orthopedic device in particular, we have had clients who have had similar types of devices. So in those cases, we really relied heavily on the outcome tools that are commonly reported in either clinical recommendations or clinical guidelines or anything like that. So when we would pull the performance outcomes, what we would generally be looking for are differences in the indications and any sort of functionality scores or something like that. So that would be sort of a performance claim. It would show that you can, based on a known standard, that's an industry standard, have you been able to show that you have a certain level of performance? I think the critical part for something like, in particular, this came up with orthopedics, but there can be a lot of variability in the way that data is reported from one article to the next. So if you can find a standard reporting metric that's more commonly used, it allows you to make that comparison more readily because you're trying to establish a range. And so if everyone's reporting it using slightly different terminology or slightly different scales, it's really challenging to come up with a range of acceptability. Whereas if you have a standard score that you can identify, that would be really helpful for the performance. And something like safety could just be related to the actual implantation of the device, so sort of the perioperative safety. But it could also get into, if you're talking about device lifetime, you may want to describe in a risk section sort of what is the intended device lifetime. Is there a risk of safety claims that come up over extended periods of time? Maybe it's bone loss or bone erosion or something to that effect. So, your risk of infection is going to be far greater in the first perioperative period compared to long-term. But you would want to make sure that you include a reference to the intended lifetime of, or life cycle of your device as part of that explanation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for us to emphasize, is that particularly for orthopedic devices, the device lifetime is a critical part of the puzzle and the part of the story. For example, for removable devices, let's just say plate and screw that fixes internal plates and screws that would fix a fracture, for example, they can be removed, but they don't have to be removed. So there's that too. They're able to be removed after bone healing and regeneration has been achieved, which in our experience, our orthopedic clients generally say for much of that is like 1 year. They've chosen 1 year often for, let's just say, an ankle fracture or something like that, at which time after that their IFU would say that it's clinically relevant and recommended by the physician or desired by the patient, the device could be removed. So again, focusing on that device lifetime, whether it has a lifetime, which is the lifetime of the patient, such as say a vertebral cage that's put in or something that stabilizes that, which would not necessarily be intended to be removed. So it that's why we think the focus should be on device lifetime for this.
And we generally work with the clients to try to identify any specific performance indicators that are particularly relevant, and also identify indications. So let's suppose you have an implantable device that is approved for both the wrist and the ankle. You may have widely different ranges in terms of performance if you're talking about a weight-bearing limb compared to a wrist. So you wouldn't necessarily pool the data from wrist indications and knee or ankle indications all under one blanket performance claim. Otherwise, you would get a very wide range. Your range will be all over the place.
Excellent point. Yes, that's an excellent point. That would apply to not just orthopedic devices, but at any point in which, say, pediatric versus adult for any
oh, definitely.
Device, really. Yeah. So that what is true for one isn't necessarily true for the other. So, and if you've got pediatric and adult indications for use, each patient population, each intended use, each clinical condition, there needs to be data. There need to be safety and performance objectives specific for those target patient populations, ages, and so forth. And so that at the end of the day, you are collecting acceptance criteria on each of those safety and performance objectives. And then when you are doing the evaluation of your device, you are making sure that you have subject device data for all of those safety and performance objectives in whatever the patient population is and whatever the indication is.
Great, thank you both. And I want to just remind everyone to keep sending in your questions using the Q&A button. That way we can make sure we keep track and can get to them. Here's our next question. Are there any special considerations for MDSW using NDCG 2020-1 when developing safety and performance parameters?
Well, Sarah, I'll let you answer that, but you might want to remind the audience what MDSW is, for example.
Yes, so this is going to be medical device software. We have been getting more and more questions about medical device software lately. So I know this is an area that a lot of folks struggle with for sure, because it does appear that there are going to be very specific ways of reporting. So when you're talking about software, I think the main thing that I keep coming across is how are you defining your life cycle processes? How are you doing verification of the software and validation of the software? And then you would also want to include any sort of along the life cycle, is there a particular risk associated with the software not functioning as intended? So the safety and performance would really tell you, it could be a very simple performance parameter, like it either detected the blood glucose level or it didn't. You know, in that case, the performance is the ability to accurately report the blood glucose level and relay that information to an insulin pump. So in terms of safety, then you would report on how often is are the ranges off for reporting? You know, are there any things related to, or are there any factors that could influence the reliability of the software being able to perform as intended? So I think that's the easiest way to envision safety and performance objectives for software is, what are ways in which this particular software might not perform as intended? Are there any identified risks associated with it malfunctioning under certain parameters, whether it's temperature or if it gets wet, you know, if the device gets wet? Yeah, anything like that is usually, that's kind of how we've been approaching these types of questions and helping to establish the safety and performance criteria.
And Sarah, wouldn't another parameter perhaps be is that what are the, within the software itself, what are the built-in fail-safe device, fail-safe detections? Like, what's the feedback loop, right? And is it performing correctly? And right. And so how is it checking itself? Because
exactly, and also looking into just sort of the risk of the in terms of the data collection. You would also want to describe the risk of the data being sort of accessed improperly, or is there a way that it could malfunction under certain situations? So I think those are the main things that I would take special attention to, but otherwise you're still performing for the treatment of a particular clinical indication. So in large part, the rest of your state-of-the-art section is going to be largely unchanged. It's just the safety and performance parameters would be unique to issues associated with the software not functioning as intended, as opposed to the device.
All right. Here's our next question. How do we demonstrate that the safety and performance objectives are appropriate and clinically relevant?
So Sarah, this gets again back to risk and benefit a little bit to me, but also with regards to the competitive landscape. Is that what are your competitors of your technology or device? What are they reporting on, and what seem to be the professional standards that are established for the type of device you have? So that's the clinical relevance piece. Any further thoughts on that?
This again is where I think having a really solid state-of-the-art and going through the medical background, you can really start to gain a sense of which of these performance objectives are directly relevant to the device in question, as opposed to accessory procedures. You know, you wouldn't want to blame everything related to a particular procedure on one part of this or one device if it's not directly clinically related. This comes up quite a bit when you talk about like the cardiovascular disease, whether you're talking about guide wires or balloons. You know, those are all going to have particular performance objectives that are directly related to one part of the system as opposed to another. So that's really where you want to make sure that you're clear on what role that particular device is playing in the procedure itself.
Right. I just was evaluating a CER that needs to be updated based on notified body feedback, and I was looking at all the comments from the regulatory response, you know, of the notified body. And one comment that they made jumped out at me, which is this was I think, a balloon dilatation catheter for cardiovascular use. And the notified body reviewer commented that in the CER that there was a comment or a claim or a sentence written about that the dilatation catheter, quote, treats coronary artery disease. They actually used the word treats coronary artery disease. And of course, the notified body reviewer kindly reminded the client that the balloon dilatation catheter doesn't treat coronary artery disease. So words matter, and to be very specific on these clinically relevant and safety and performance objectives is really important.
Great, thank you, Laurie. Here's our next question. Do you use confidence intervals or ranges for acceptance criteria?
Sarah, that's you.
So yes, so we definitely use a range to allow us to identify the acceptance criteria. So if you're developing a competitive landscape, you would want to identify relevant clinical data across the literature from different competitors. So let's say you're selling ice cream and you're looking at the melting temperature, like how long does it take to melt? You would collect, it takes anywhere from 5 minutes to 10 minutes, depending on which brand of ice cream you're talking about. So then you would present sort of a range of acceptability to present at the end. So in terms of performance, you would then state that your subject device performs at least as good as your closest competitors, and that your safety is lower than your closest competitors in terms of any safety outcomes. So you would want to make sure that you fall within that range, but you're in particular looking at that high end or the low end, whether you're talking about safety or performance.
So I'll continue on what Sarah's talking about to remind us that if you've set your safety and performance objectives, and you now, and let's just say there's 5 of them, 2 safety and 3 performance, let's say, and they're clinically relevant, they're relevant to the clinical conditions and to the devices under evaluation, you're good there. Now, what do you do then? You go out to your competitors and your competitor device literature search, and from the reviewed and selected articles that are relevant from that search, you're going to now pull the data on, let's just say, rate of peri-procedural bleeding due, measured by BARC, the BARC scale. So you're going to go and you're going to look for in your competitor device literature. You're going to find every time that's been identified, and you can pull, 6.8% from one article, and 1.2 from another, and 9.8 from another, and 5.2 from another. It's going to be a big table. And then what Sarah's talking about is, and what's the range now? At the end of the day, there are 15 competitor articles in which that particular safety objective was reported, and the range was from 1.2% to 9.8%. So since that's a safety, Sarah, you said that the safety is the lower of the 2, right?
Yes, you'd want to make sure that, let's say that you see a particular safety outcome in 1 to 5%. You would want to make sure that you fall under that 5% mark. If the rate
your subject device data, right? Your subject device data later on in the CER, when you're now comparing your rates on your subject device data to those acceptance criteria, it's commonly accepted that you would compare yourself to the lower bound of the range of in the acceptability criteria, the lower bound number for safety and the upper bound number for performance objectives, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So that's a big question, because they asked about actually confidence intervals, which then just strengthens the data. But the ranges is an important concept to understand. It's like, how do I use these ranges? And that's the short answer and the approach that we've always taken. Go ahead.
Okay, next question. For safety and performance acceptance, how do you take reference of the international standards that are in place?
Yes,
Sarah?
so you'll definitely want to make sure that you are presenting any standards. This can come into play, like let's say if you're doing an IVD test and there's a certain range, like in order to test positive for COVID, you have to have 2 out of 3 markers that test positive. You would want to make sure that you explain that clearly and also explain how your particular test is addressing that known international standard. So when you're talking about your performance, you may have to say that I have these 3 different analytes that I'm attempting to detect. A positive means I need to get 2 out of 3. How often are each one of these analytes testing positive or negative? Are there certain ranges of false positives or false negatives for one marker versus another? All of those things will have to be sort of taken into account. So we usually do a systematic literature review search and include terms that allow us to make sure that we're identifying any clinical recommendations or guidelines that are out there. And also make sure that you have identified whether or not there are differences between the standards, because we will encounter this on a fairly regular basis where there are, from one country to the next, there may be different definitions of what constitutes a positive test, or how that, like what's the actual diagnostic algorithm for that test. They may differ. So having a section within the state of the art that clearly defines the international standards that are at play will definitely help you justify your choice of safety and performance criteria.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to jump in and say a word about systematic literature review. Sarah just mentioned that you would want to do a search of professional standards and international standards relevant to the device under evaluation. A word about systematic literature reviews and what the notified body expects to see with regards to both in vitro devices and both MDR and IVDR. They are really looking for methodologically sound, robust, replicatable searches. The standards that the notified bodies use to assess the quality of the searches has to do with is it reproducible? Does it follow kind of best practice for a systematic literature review? Is it fully documented in the CER and so forth? And generally speaking, internet searches, especially when you're pulling device data, is not adequate to their standards of either the MDR or the IVDR. So proceed with caution if you're depending on internet searches for all of your searching. There's many searches that go into a CER or PER. It's the state of the art section, the subject device and the competitor device data, separate searches there. And then this international standards, which is often folded into the state of the art search. So if you don't have the ability to do these methodologically robust state of the art searches, you might want to investigate getting a service that can do that for you.
All right. Here's our next question. How do you establish performance criteria that meet state of the art?
What do you think,
So,
Sarah?
yeah, this is kind of the, I think what they're asking is, how do you define that you fall under this definition of state of the art? So for state of the art, what you are trying to establish is that your device performs as intended, and it falls within sort of this acceptable range. And your goal through the SOA section and this landscape analysis is to define what you mean by acceptable. So we typically will describe the alternative therapeutic options in a section of the SOA. So if you are comparing yourself, if you are some sort of an invasive cardiovascular device, you wouldn't compare yourself to anticoagulant therapy. You know, they're going to have very different safety and performance criteria, but you may want to describe what is the risk of developing a PE within 6 months if you are only taking anticoagulant therapy versus if you use this device. So you can definitely use your performance criteria to refer back to these alternatives as part of that. But the performance criteria, you want to ensure that your device performs within a range that is similar to all other competitor devices. So that's where it's going to be really critical to clearly define your alternatives versus your competitors, so that you are comparing yourself and developing these criteria based on the correct data set.
Okay, let's get to our next question. How should we approach analysis of clinical data for secondary safety and performance objectives differently from primary?
I'll let Sarah answer this, but I know that she's gonna zoom in on the primary versus secondary reference here for safety and performance objectives. So Sarah, maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
This question generally comes up on like a first draft of a CER, mostly because it's trying to sort of establish the scope of your analysis. We don't distinguish between secondary and primary. If you have a safety and performance objective that you are using, they're all weighted equivalent. You wouldn't have some secondary implying that they're not quite as important or they're being weighted differently. So like, for instance, if you're, the main place this has come up before is things like bleeding or like a vascular complication. So in that definition, I would define a primary objective, safety objective would be like a VARC2 complication or something to that effect. Whereas a secondary, I guess, based on this definition, would be defining each one of those complications separately. So you can do that if you have a specific need to report on thromboembolism or some other very specific complication. You wouldn't classify that differently. You would just include it as a safety and performance objective. So I think that's kind of what the question is getting at, sort of like how detailed do I need to be and how do I define, like if I'm going to include some of these less important, but for the sake of your presentation, you wouldn't want to sort of undersell any particular safety objective. If you describe it and you state that it's there, it's expected that you're going to have an analysis of clinical data related to that particular objective.
Yes, and remembering that these safety and performance objectives are meant to, at the end of the day, carry all the way through the CER, all the way through to your risk benefits section, and the analysis surrounding the safety and performance data that you have on your subject device. It's supposed to carry all the way through to the risk benefits section to demonstrate at the end of the day, we all know what it is the device safe and performs as intended in the patient populations, using the right indications, the right clinical conditions, and and safe has to do with harms. So all of that is tied together at the end, and so there's no such thing in our mind, and never have we written a CER where there are two levels of a safety and performance objectives. So they're all treated the same.
Okay. Here's our next question. How should you justify not using all outcomes analyzed in the CER for specific S&P objectives?
Sarah, you want to tackle that? I'm not sure what's being gotten to there.
Really would not include analyzed outcomes as part of your CER and then ignore them within the safety and performance objectives. I've found that if you give information that feels incomplete, it's going to be a red flag, and they're going to ask you, well, you just described this bleeding risk, and yet that's not one of your safety objectives. Where is it? So I would make sure that the outcomes that you've analyzed are in very close alignment with your safety and performance objectives, and they are reflected within the IFU. And so it sort of ties back to your CEP, making sure you are clear on your intended purpose, your intended target groups, and the benefits associated with your particular device, and that you're not presenting something and then not explaining it.
Yes, I think that last statement was really important, is that, and another addition I'll say to that is to remember you're going to analyze your subject device data based upon the safety and performance, against the safety and performance objectives and the acceptance criteria that you defined. Now, that doesn't mean that other things happened in a particular study of 150 patients in an article that you identified on your subject device. AEs happen and so forth. Those are noted in the CER. The way we tackle subject device section of the clinical data section, subject published data, non-manufacturer held data, is that we essentially write up a short critique of every single included article. It's a very short summary. And in that short summary, there would be that, that there was noted AEs and so forth that were noted. That's part of the evaluation, the landscape evaluation. That doesn't mean you analyze it. You're just reporting it. There's a difference between analysis, statistical analysis and analysis of it, versus we're just telling you it happened. And so that's another important thing, is you analyze the data that are relevant to the safety and performance objectives. Do you need to report other significant incidents, AEs, that happen within the subject device published landscape? Yes, you do need to report those. Doesn't mean they go into an analysis, but they do then translate out to the risk benefit section, because now there's discussion that something may have been identified. And remember, the CER and the PER is meant at the end of the day to be a feedback loop back into your risk management system. So there we are, is the notified bodies want to see that we're looking for harms that are reported in published literature and reporting them, so that ultimately they can be fed back into your risk management system. And it's there that those new incidents of harms are analyzed, essentially, and then may change the risk or benefit profile of the device over time.
All right, let's get to our next question. For wet devices, can these endpoints be based on PMS data if no literature of similar devices is available?
So a quick reminder that WET, that acronym stands for Well-Established Technology.
Yes, so I think
Sarah,
I actually just saw one of these in the chat box as well, or the Q&A section as well. So when you're looking at legacy devices, it can be tricky because your goal really is to show that your clinical evaluation is based on sufficient clinical evidence. So that's a very sort of broad definition, but if it's been if you have a legacy device or a well-established technology and the clinical evaluation thus far is based on sufficient clinical data, if it's been in use for an extended period of time, and if it's been prepared in compliance with any specific product-specific specifications, you would not need direct clinical data. So in that case, you could basically use some of this sort of indirect supportive data as part of your description, but you would really, you're going to be held to a lower level of clinical evidence, or that could be justified, but you would rely on your post-market clinical follow-up data and your quality management system. So you would want to make sure that you not only clearly show why you can be classified as a well-established technology, but also how you are going about ensuring that you continue to be low risk and that there is little evolution in terms of the state of the art overall. So that will be supported by your post-market surveillance, but you'll want to make sure that you're very clear on why the state of the art really hasn't changed with respect to that particular clinical condition and the role that your device plays in treating it.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that is a great place to end on. That is all the time that we have for today. So if we did not get to your questions, please send us an email to consult@Criterion Edge, and we will try to answer them for you. For more questions on the content we discussed today, or if you would like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free scoping of your PER or CER. Our contact information again is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, Sarah and Laurie, and everyone for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Take care, and we hope to see you next year.